David Bohm, I wonder for our audience if you could give us an idea of the kinds of problems you've been interested in theoretical physics during your scientific career.
Yeah. Well, I began always with an interest in the general nature of matter in the universe, but I did work originally on more restricted problems in nuclear physics and in what is the construction of various machines like the cyclotron, and also in what is called plasma, that the highly ionized gas. And I gradually, my interest moved more toward understanding the fundamentals of physics and quantum mechanics and relativity. And I became especially interested in how these fundamental theories are not clear, that their basic ideas are unclear, and they contradict each other.
Okay, before we get into those contradictions, which I think will form the bulk of our discussion here, as strictly a layperson, one of the things that intrigues me is that it seems to me physics for many, many years ran on the idea that nature could ultimately be understood in its most fundamental way. If we broke matter down into small parts, we'd find out the properties of elementary particles, and then we could rebuild the whole universe. And certainly in biology today, biologists feel if they understand the molecular basis of cells, that we'll eventually be able to reconstruct life. I gather in physics this isn't such an optimistic view anymore. That is, people are finding this may not be so. Could you tell us what that problem is?
Yes. The problem, there are several problems. One is that it is not possible actually to analyze the world into particles. You see, what are called particles, such as electrons, also may behave like waves. Or by something in between, according to the circumstance. They are not predictable, nor do they have the properties that a mechanical particle ought to have. That when many of them get together, they have properties of the whole which cannot be analyzed through the parts. And so that is one point. That's what quantum mechanics says. And relativity also says, in another sense, the universe cannot be divided. And even if we leave all that out, the search, see, physicists, in spite of all this, have generally believed that eventually one could find the ultimate building blocks of the universe. And first they thought it was the atom, with the very word atom means indivisible, and then came the electrons and protons and neutrons, which were supposed to constitute the atom. Then later, the protons and neutrons were found to have a structure they could turn into many other new particles, and now they're supposed to have smaller particles called quarks and partons. And the attempt to find a fundamental particle has continually eluded us. See, every time we thought it was so, it turned out that there was a finer constitution. And also, we have these properties of wholeness to say that the very entities we discover cannot really be understood as particles anyway.
It's all very mysterious. Every time I interview a physicist, and they start telling me about the nature of photons, for example, they have no mass, their energy, they behave like waves, and it becomes a very kind of mysterious universe to me. What are the kinds of problems you found as you began to really delve into the nature of matter and so on?
Well, the fundamental problem was just this one, that we were supposed to consider the world made of particles. The particle that we begin with as a small extended object like a tiny billiard ball. And you find that the theory of relativity says it cannot be that. And also, the particle was supposed to move continuously, causally, its future determined, and locally, in the sense that each particle existed in its own space, independent of the others, just interacting mechanically. Right? Now, the theory of relativity made it impossible to hold to the idea of a particle, because if you imagined it to be like a billiard ball, this would contradict the theory of relativity. It would mean an impulse could be transmitted across the particle faster than light, and that would contradict the theory of relativity. So there were no particles. It was not possible to say the world was made of particles. And to avoid that, physicists went to the idea of a particle of zero extension, a point, a mathematical point. But that led into further contradictions of infinite fields, which have not really been resolved. And the third point is that quantum mechanics shows that the idea of entirely local properties of particles breaks down, that there are peculiar relationships between particles, which are really present both theoretically and proved in experiment, that cannot be understood as a causal connection across the space.
Now, dealing with that kind of difficulty, how do physicists then handle that?
Well, they don't handle it. Essentially, they ignore the problem. You see, that in the old days, people used to want to explain things. You see, now they feel it's not necessary. That if you can find equations that enable you to calculate the observations that we make, it's felt this is enough. That is, one has got to a much more pragmatic approach, in the sense that, although people don't admit it, they say that the main purpose of physics is to calculate results. You see, that what they say is that when students first take quantum mechanics, they find they can't understand it. And about a year later, they say there's nothing to understand because it's just a system of computation.
So now I don't understand that. I mean, are people now getting so much into their machines and their analytical tools that the numbers they get out become all important, well, rather than the phenomena there?
That's on one side, that's part of it. See, it's confused, because on the other side, people firmly believe that they're going to find the fundamental building blocks of the universe. They feel they're really real. But when it comes to discuss what they mean, they then say, well, they don't mean, they're just computations. You see, I think people haven't thought out the full. Each person does his little bit, the fragments, and each person does his little bit and doesn't worry too much about what's beyond. And he may perhaps assume that somebody else has taken care of it. And so the whole thing just goes on without people generally worrying about what the whole thing means.
Well, you take us into the Bohmian view of how we may look at these and deal with these real profound paradoxes or dilemmas.
Yeah, well, the way I started was that one could see that relativity and quantum theory, the two most fundamental theories of matter, really contradict each other in the sense that relativity is local, it's causal, it's determinate, it's continuous, and quantum mechanics is just the opposite. It's non-causal, it's non-continuous, it has discrete jumps, but things not passing through the intermediate space, and it's non-local. It has these peculiar properties, electrons connected at long distances. So with that absolute contradiction of the two basic theories, I said we could try to find out what they had in common. Now, what they have in common is what I call undivided wholeness. You see, the view of relativity which Einstein was pursuing was that that there's only a general field. Particles are concentrated regions of field which spread out through the universe and merge with others. So the particle is an abstraction, according to Einstein. There's only a whole field which is undivided, right?
All right.
And that's the undivided wholeness is what characterizes that theory. Now, quantum mechanics in a very different way comes to the same thing, because it says energy exists in the form of indivisible quanta, and the entire movement of the universe is made up of unbreakable, indivisible links, you see, and which include the observer and the observed. See, it includes us as well as the atom we're looking at. And so relativity and quantum theory both agree on that. So I said that would be the starting point, to start from the whole and to say the parts are abstractions from the whole. They have no independent existence. Now, I think you can get a simple image of that if you look in water and see a whirlpool or a vortex. See, it looks like an entity, but it isn't. It's nothing but a constant pattern of movement in the water. If you put another whirlpool in, the two penetrate each other, merge, and produce one new pattern. They do not produce two separate whirlpools interacting. And we want to say suppose the atoms are that way. That's a very rough picture, but it gives you an idea. The electrons, the protons, the entire universe is built that way.
Well, I'm really struggling to hang on to this, because I can understand at the level of the particles that physicists study.
Yeah.
And maybe even constructing matter like this chair or you and me, that there is this interconnection. But what about the vast spaces of outer space that connect various bodies in the heavens? Are you implying?
No, that too, yes.
That too?
Yes, to say that as the field spreads, you can see immediately the field spreads. See, light is also carried by this field, so the entire universe is connected through that field. Electric fields, light, various forces are gravitational forces. And so that space is merging with matter. Matter, in that view, is a certain property of that space, which is a bit more concentrated or something.
Okay, but you implied there that there is a wholeness.
Yes.
And yet it seems to me that certainly I have the conceit to think that I'm an individual, that I have my own uniqueness and individuality, and I run around, and what I do here has no real connection with anyone else.
Well, that's an abstraction. You see, if you just think a little while, you'll see it can't be true what you've said. You see, you're surrounded by air, water, and so on. And if you were not surrounded in that way, it wouldn't last very long. Now, also, you're surrounded by people who feed you and keep you alive, and also give communications which keep your mind going. And a person totally isolated would never even be human, right? Now, so I think just a little observation shows that that view is not really true, that at best it holds as an abstraction. Now, also materially, see, if you take waves passing up through a pond, they pass right through each other, right, as if there weren't any. But if you put a rock in there, you see the rock scatters the waves, so the waves would show up that rock. They wouldn't show each other up, right? Now, when we think of empty space as carrying matter and waves, and insofar as this movement passes through without deflection, we would say that that's what we mean by emptiness. You see, it doesn't necessarily mean that space is empty, but merely matter and waves of light and various things pass through it. Now, there's an interesting thing in physics. If you take a metal which is made of atoms, and they may be in a crystal form or very regular, at absolute zero of temperature, these atoms are in a perfect order. And if you pass electrons through, you can show they don't deflect, right? They go right through. Now, if you raise the temperatures, you get some irregularities. Now, if you were to pass electrons through the metal and use them to make an electron microscope, they would not show up the metal, they would only show up the irregularities apparently existing independently. Is that clear?
Yes.
I think that this sort of analogy gives some idea of what I mean, that that all these things which seem to exist independently are merely manifestations of something much deeper. And it's like the iceberg, as they say, the top of the iceberg, only far more so.
Okay, now let's take where you've led us so far, and as I say, I'm barely hanging on, I think, and go further into the way that you feel our very ideas and our look at the way we look at matter is can be altered with your ideas. That is, how has that perspective really changed your look at what physicists do?
Well, you see, I've developed a theory along these lines, which I call the enfolded order, or the implicate order. I don't know if you want to go into that now.
Well, let's have a try.
The ordinary idea of matter is it's an object which exists external to other objects, and passes through space continuously and goes from here to there, right, and connects up with other objects and makes the whole that way. Now, I want to propose, to give the idea of what I mean, I saw once on BBC television a device which I realized would be very useful for my purposes. It was made at the Royal Institution in London, and it consisted of two glass cylinders, concentric, one inside the other. The inner one was held fixed, and the outer one turned slowly. And you placed a very viscous fluid, such as glycerine, in between the two cylinders. Now, as you turn the outer cylinder, the glycerine on the outside is turning, the glycerine on the inside is fixed, and in between it's moving intermediate rate. So if you took a small bit of glycerine, it would slowly get drawn out into a thread. Is that clear?
No, wait, you've got glycerin in your tube, in your cylinder,
between the two
right?
cylinders.
And then you put a drop of...
The next stage is to put a drop of insoluble ink, which consists of particles of carbon, for example.
So you can see this drop suspended
That's
in
right,
the glycerin.
suspended there. And each particle of carbon is now carried along by the glycerin, at the speed of the glycerin. And since the outer parts of the glycerin move faster, the particles of carbon are carried apart. Eventually, they become so fine as to be invisible, right? Now, you then turn this machine around slowly, and the particles retrace their paths, and suddenly it forms a droplet again of glycerin, right? And that actually happens. I saw this happening the first time there when it was shown on the program. And we actually have, and now, I propose now that this droplet has been folded into the glycerin, right? And it is then unfolded. And now I want to say that that sort of process helps to explain the behavior of particles. That is, it's only an analogy. We mustn't take it too literally. But For example, suppose I put two droplets in, one next to the other, near the other, and I fold it up. Now, the particles from one droplet are going to sort of mix with the particles of the other, so they're indistinguishable. Yet if we turn the machine around, each particle seems to know where it must go, and it goes backward to help form its own droplet again, right?
Right.
So,
now, what does that illustrate?
Well, that illustrates a new order, because we say, see, if we put in a number of droplets in a row, you see you have what's called an order, right? And we could fold them all up. The order seems to be absent, but it's still present, because when you unfold it, it'll all come right out again. So I say there's a non-manifest order. There's an implicate enfolded order, right?
Okay.
And I said that notion of order is a different notion of order from the one which science has been using, which is the unfolded or explicate order, in which we say only things outside each other count, and only external relationships of things outside each other are to be part of the fundamental laws of physics.
Well, a scientist would look at what was in the cylinder at any given moment and then try to describe the relationships of the various streams of...
That's the way you would analyze it, but that's why I say it's only an analogy. But I say that movement abstracted from this analogy is what I want to use. I say quantum mechanics has this process of unfoldment without being able to reduce it to the bits of glycerin and carbon. Is that clear?
Okay.
So the bits of glycerin and carbon are only an illustration of something which I want to call attention to, which is different, right? Is that clear?
Yes.
Now, therefore, what I'm saying is that the fundamental properties of matter are moving in this order of unfoldment. And I give you an idea. Let's suppose we go back to that analogy, and I put in a particle and turn it a certain number of times. I call it n times. I put a particle in a slightly different position and turn it n more times. The first one is 2n. We go on. The third is n, 2n, 3n. We put in a large number, and we now turn it backward fairly rapidly. One droplet after another emerges, and it looks as if a particle is continuously crossing the space.
Right.
Now, I say that's the image that I want to give as to what a particle really is in quantum mechanics, that sort of movement. And therefore, the particle is present in the whole and is merely unfolding and manifesting as a separate thing, but its actual existence is not separate. It is an abstraction. That droplet, that separate droplet, is an abstraction due to our perception, right? Now, we say everything folds into everything, and I want to say that the entire universe is unfolding, and that this will explain many of the peculiar effects of quantum mechanics. For example, if we put in a different environment, it will unfold in a different way, more like a wave rather than a particle, and many other ways. That this will provide a way of not only understanding the quantum mechanics, but of bringing about a theory which would allow relativity in quantum mechanics to be particular theories with approximations within this more general theory.
Now, is there a way of showing or investigating that type of a universe that is enfolded and unfolding? I mean, do we have the tools to...
Well, at present, I have to begin with this. In one sense, I'd say experimentally, that's just what our electrons are doing. You see, they're behaving both like waves and like particles, but our language doesn't, call attention to that very well, but tends to talk about building blocks all the time, and prevents us from thinking that way. Now, the mathematics of quantum mechanics does, which is a certain kind of algebra, does actually describe that, and I'm working on that to make an extension of that mathematics, so that we could make a picture in which the mathematics and this particular way of thinking would agree. And it can be, first of all, investigated mathematically, and then eventually, when the thing is developed theoretically, and when it is developed far enough, it might lead to some new experiments.
What has the scientific community said about this way of approaching the...
Well, I've talked over with a certain number, and different people have different responses, but, quite a few people would like the idea to succeed, but they don't feel that they want to bother with it until they see that it is succeeding. That is... others, I don't know, but I'm saying that I think that if it were actually to work, that the community would accept it.
You hope?
I hope. Well, I feel reasonably sure they would, actually. I mean, having seen enough of the response, right? At least a considerable number would. I mean, not all of them.
Okay, now I've had a very profound insight into what you're saying, and I've got to go home and think about this, but I should say to the audience that the reason you're here in Canada right now is you've come over in association with a foundation or an organization whose leader is Krishnamurti. And in my mind, again as a layperson, Krishnamurti I would associate with, well, a religious or a spiritual group. And I'm wondering what a physicist, a theoretical physicist, is doing with this particular organization.
Yeah, well, this is a good question. It requires a rather long answer, I'm afraid.
It's okay.
See, first of all, I think that my own interest in science, and many of them interest in science, is not entirely separate from what is behind the interest in religion or in philosophy. That is to understand the whole of the universe, the whole of matter, you know, how we originate and so on. And I think that was Einstein's interest, for example, that he felt that even that it was, he had some notion of a non-personal God who had created this universe, or which had created the universe, that man would somehow understand the plan on which it was created. But I'm not sure I share exactly Einstein's view, but I wanted to give it. Now, also, when I was younger, I felt that in the beginning that science would surely be a source of benefiting mankind, you know, and I had no question about it. But as things went on, I found that it wasn't doing that. You know, that it was causing a lot of problems, which you know, made many things worse. Some things were made better, but many other things were made worse. Now, and I began to feel that something beyond science would be needed to approach this question. You see, that science alone could not guarantee that it would be used for benefiting mankind, the scientific impulse. Though in the beginning I thought it would, just truth alone. Right? Then I began to look into philosophy and Eastern and Western and so on, and some people with religious ideas. I mean, just simply looking at it when I was in Bristol in England. And my wife and I used to go to the public library, and she discovered a book by Krishnamurti, and she read in there the words of the observer and the observed. And I had been interested in that because in quantum mechanics that is a key question, in the sense that because of this undivided wholeness, the two cannot be separated. And so she assumed that this was a form of quantum mechanics. And she showed me the book, but I became very interested in the book, and which I felt opened up many new things. And finally I wrote to the publisher and found out where Krishnamurti was, and we met and had discussions. And you know, after that I began to become more closely associated with him and his work. Now, essentially, the point made by Krishnamurti was that the problems of mankind originate in thought itself, in consciousness itself, you see. And as previous to that, you know, I had grown up believing that poverty was the main problem of mankind, and science would help me eliminate that. And I could see that no matter how far science went, it probably wouldn't, and even if it did, it wouldn't really it wouldn't really make mankind happy.
But you know, we're always teaching our children that the more rational we are, the more knowledge we have, the more we think,
yeah,
the better we'll be able to solve our problems.
Well, I think what Krishnamurti made clear was we are going to be incapable of that rationality until we go much more deeply into ourselves. That if we were really rational, it would solve these problems, but we cannot be that rational. That we may be very rational in working out some problem in nuclear physics, but we cannot be rational in how we apply nuclear physics. For example, we've used it destructively. We can now overkill the population of the world I don't know how many times, and we also have destroyed the environment, and we have produced destruction of natural resources, shortages such as the oil shortage, and thousands of other problems because of the basic irrationality, the irrational ends toward which we apply our discoveries.
Okay, I can understand that, but where do we, again, how do we get that link? It seems to me that science is one thing that you've done. Krishnamurti's ideas on the world and the problems is another. Is there a link that connects the two?
Yes, you see, the link is that thought itself, consciousness, is caught in a certain irrationality, in a certain disorder, confusion. When that thought is conditioned. You see, we ordinarily think that our thought is free, that we can just be free to think what is true, right? But we're not that free, because everything that happens is recorded in the brain, actually materially. You could almost think of a tape recording. And this record is replayed as a set of instructions, similar to a computer program that makes us act in certain ways, to think, feel, and act in certain ways. So we may think that a certain thing is true just because it's on the program, and we act accordingly, according to that program, right? Now, see, that program is put in very early, not merely the useful things like language and techniques and all that, but also all sorts of prejudices and hopes and fears and beliefs. And now that program gives rise to many irrationalities. For example, there's desire. You see, we are moved by desire. You see, now desire, Krishnamurti, comes from the program. Now we've distinguished desire and true passion, which is a tremendous energy that is creative. Desire is programmed, and what you really want out of desire is some sort of state of perfection of consciousness. You want everything to be happy and good and right and orderly and harmonious and everything just right, you see. And that's the ultimate aim of desire. Now, the object of desire is not really desired at all. It's merely a means to the end, which is the state of consciousness, right? So we go through one object after another seeking this state, and it doesn't work. Now, it's not merely that disappointment arises in there, but desire creates self-deception. That is, the quickest way to satisfy desire momentarily is to engage in wishful thinking. That is, to arrange your ideas according to what you desire, you see. So I think that this self-deception, I've observed, is one of the major components of human thought. That is, most thought is self-deception. In fact, the dominant thought is almost always self-deception. However rational you may be in applying your techniques, the end is always determined by self-deceptive thought.
Can you give us an example of how that would work?
Yes, well, I'll give you an example of self-deception first. I take flattery. You see, a person may have been hurt as a child and loses confidence in himself. It's on the program. The program is always demanding overcoming that, so anybody who tells him he is good and right and so on is believed to be true. And he can do anything, right? And everybody is seeking flattery and becoming very annoyed with insults and getting angry. And also people get angry, say, for not just for a second, as young children do, but for years and even, say, hundreds of years with, you know, nations fighting each other, like Northern and Southern Irish and so on. And it all goes on the program, you see, generation after generation. Now, so you can see that, see, people have, what do they want out of life? Their supreme value. You see, some people want money, some people want power, some people want security, right? Well, they will believe anything which they think will which will aid that aim. You see that you can see the kind of self-deception that goes on, for example, about the oil shortage. It was known, say, in 1960 that there was going to be one. Nobody did anything about it. It became glaringly obvious in 1973, and since that period, nothing has been done about it. And people are still saying that's a story invented by the oil companies to raise prices, you see, which... and because it feels better to believe that.
They'd rather believe they're going to still have their cars. And,
yeah, that it's all going to be work out, you see.
Now, what does Krishnamurti offer as far as dealing with that self-deception?
Well, what Krishnamurti is suggesting is that we have got to somehow get at that program, you see. Now, that is not easy to get at, because, you see, the program is recorded in the brain cells somehow, not exactly known how, and we have no organs inside the brain or nerves to tell us what those programs are doing, right? You can even cut into the brain and not feel anything, right? All our sensations come from nerves that are connected to sense organs, right? Now, what Krishnamurti proposes is there is nevertheless a way to be aware of that program, give it attention, as we give attention to an object outside. You see, the program is a material structure as this is, but one is inside, the other is outside. This thing outside, we don't depend only on memory to know what it is, but our senses also tell us something directly, right? So our thought is informed by the senses. Now, when it comes to looking inside, we haven't got any real senses, and we depend mostly on memory, which tells us nothing because it's just the program speaking. So what we can do is to observe this program reflected in two ways. We make a mirror, both in our relationships with others, which will show us our programs, and then also watching the feelings which those programs are producing in ourselves, like fear, anger, you know, all the sensations all over the body, seeing the connection between thought and that state of sensation and feeling and bodily action. For example, if you're frightened, you see the whole body is tense, the heart beats faster, you may feel a sinking sensation in the stomach, and you say, I am afraid. Now, that is the mistake. You see, you don't see that, generally speaking, any sustained fear is part of the fear program. But you can actually see it if you really give it your attention and really work hard at it, and see that there's a connection between a certain thought and a certain fear or anger or pleasure or pain or sorrow or whatnot, right? And now, therefore, those feelings become the mirror of your program.
Now, with all of this, what are you saying that's much different from what a psychotherapy is in North America? I mean,
well, they don't tell you to do this at all. You see,
I thought you look at yourself and you try to.
They don't tell you
what
to look at. You see, for example, they may tell you to go back to your past and find the incident which produced this thing, but that won't change the program, right? Now, if they tell you to look at yourself, they're not telling you what to look at. You see, if I say look at yourself, what are you going to look at? I mean, you know, you could say, I see that I'm you know, in trouble on certain points, but I feel certain feelings which are me, right? See, they accept the ego, and once you accept the ego, there is no way out. You see, they accept the ultimate reality of the ego, as the physicist is looking for the ultimate particle.
Right.
Instead of saying the ego is nothing but a structure in the whole, which can come and go, right? Now, if you say these feelings of anger, let's say you're angry, right? Somebody has said something to you, he's hurt you, and you're angry. Now you say, this anger is me, being angry, and therefore my problem is either I must show the anger is justified, right? I think the anger is justified, or I say I shouldn't be angry. Well, both of those are merely modifications of the program. You see, your thought comes from the program, like the computer, so your thought says, this anger is justified, and you go on with it, or your thought says it's not justified and I shouldn't go on with it.
But you haven't dealt with the fundamental question of being angry?
No, because it's on the program. See, if you had a machine which was angry, see, programmed to be angry, now you could put on another program, don't be angry, and we'd just be fighting each other. Or you could put on a program saying it's perfectly all right to go on being angry.
Okay, once you have that perception, though, that you're not dealing with it properly.
Yes.
If you try to rationalize it or understand it, then what do you do at that point?
Well, you see, what you have to do is to touch the actual material process of the program, right?
Right.
Now, see, awareness can touch that. You see that, for example, see, this program is nonsense, really. Is that clear? Some programs make sense, but this one doesn't. Now, generally, when you see nonsense in a simple affair, it loses its power over you. You see, if you said, I thought I was going north, and I see I'm actually going south, and you say, I don't feel an impulse to keep on going north, right? But you see, if you're angry and you can see that this thing is leading you into all sorts of nonsense, but you find you can't stop it because you haven't got to the bottom of it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you can really see this thing at work, to see it is actually originating from memory, producing that feeling, then it becomes plain that it's nonsense, that there's no point to just keeping this machinery going. And
in a sense, that program then is erased. Or
it's made null and void, right? Or erased, I don't know.
Have you actually experienced that yourself?
Yes, I can see it. Now, you see, it requires that you keep on giving it attention. You see, there's no guarantee that it won't happen again, but when you understand what's involved, you see, you can go into it each time, and when you've seen the basic point.
Now, the problem for me, I guess, is that I can understand that in terms of dealing with individuals, with people who come within your own sphere so that you can touch and interact with them.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very important kind of insight to have. Meanwhile, though, the world is rushing by. All sorts of terrible things are happening at the level of nations and groups of nations and so on. I mean, does this kind of insight have any relevance to the great global forces that threaten our very existence?
Well, in two ways. You see, first of all, the source of this global force is exactly the same as the source of what happens in the individual. That is the collective programs, right? That if they aren't changed, nothing can be done. You see, people have tried by every means imaginable, by religion, by science, by politics, to change this, and nothing has happened, right? It has gone on much the same over thousands of years. Now, somehow that is not going to change fundamentally unless you get at the root of it. Now, you see, the society is basically identical with the individual at this deep root, right? The society is nothing but the totality of individuals who are caught in this, who are in turn reinforcing each other. So we first of all have to understand what the problem is, because we may be just following a false hope by hoping that we're going to straighten it out in some other way. I mean, it may produce a momentary improvement, but it cannot really get rid of it. Now, the second point is that we cannot directly affect that thing. It's like, you know, almost like Niagara Falls, right? It's going on its own way.
Right.
And but there may be a way, in the sense that if we had, see, each person who understands this in some way has removed himself from it. He's not adding to it. But also, I think that if we could get a considerable number of people who are doing this, who are able to do this, they would be able to really think together. See, ordinarily people can't think together. Each one has his own opinion, which is based on his own conditioning. And people really pay very little attention to each other when they try to think together, right? Now, if, say, say 10 or 20 or 30 people could really think together with one mind, I think they would liberate a tremendous energy which would affect the others, not perhaps finally in the sense of getting rid of the whole problem, but at least diverting. It would make possible a diversion of the present stream to something less dangerous. You see, I think a few...
What makes you think there's that much energy in just a small number of people?
I think there's tremendous energy in people, but they don't allow it to develop, you see, unfold. Krishnamurti likes to give various examples, like saying people like Hitler and Stalin have had tremendous energy, although they used it, no, it was done with evil purposes and so on, but a few people can give a tremendous impetus to the whole of society. And I think if somebody like Toynbee once said, you know, that in the beginning, each civilization begins with a few people of very high energy who get things started. And it sort of rises up to the top and then falls because the energy gets lost. And the way I would say the energy gets lost is that the civilization accumulates traditions which are accumulated in the brain cells, and gradually the brain cells fill up with programs and people can't do anything new, right? So the civilization dies. Now, so I think that you can see now that very few leaders, for example, have any energy. You see, one looks at the politicians and say they're just repeating the same old story, though anybody should be able to see that none of the things they propose is going to work. Well,
you're right on. We're running in a Canadian election right now. You're right on, yes.
Somehow, some source of new ideas is needed of a much higher energy. Something both original and very full of energy and passion, and which would be relevant to the actual problems. And I think that would actually, I think if people could see that there was something which would really be relevant to the problems and would divert us from this disaster we're approaching, it would take hold.
David Bohm, unfortunately we've run out of time and we've barely skimmed the surface. I always I'm very concerned about the electronic media because of the superficiality of the whole thing, and I think what we're showing right now is that we've barely begun to penetrate your mind to share some of these ideas, and I'm just sorry we don't have more time. Thank you very much for coming here.